The cold had come down out of the north 3 days before, the hard, clear, killing cold of the deep winter, and it had turned the whole country to iron. She had felt it coming the way you feel such things, in the flat white sky and the way the snow had stopped falling, and simply lain there gone to crust, and in the silence, the enormous brittle silence of a land frozen too hard even for the wind. And she had known she needed to be somewhere with a stove and a wall before the dark. Because the cold that comes down clear like that is the cold that kills the people who are caught out in it, quietly, without fuss, the way it means to kill everything that cannot find a fire. She knew that cold. She had been cold most of the winters of her life, the ordinary miserable cold of doorways and culverts and the lee sides of walls, and she had learned the difference between the cold that only makes you wretched and the cold that means to end you, and this was the second kind. It had a stillness to it, a purity, that the wretched cold never had. It did not gust or bite, it simply lay on the land and pressed, patient, total, and it got into the marrow past any shivering, and she knew that a person who lay down in it to rest would rest a while and grow warm, the false warmth that is the last lie the cold tells, and never get up, and that this was not a thing to be walked through or waited out, but a thing to be sheltered from, absolutely, behind a wall and beside a fire, or not survived. She was 23 years old, and she had been following a dead rail line up a frozen river valley all the short gray day, walking the grade where the snow lay thinnest, and as the light began to fail, she came to the place where the line left the ground. The valley opened, and the river swung away in its frozen bed, and the grade ran on out over the gap on a trestle, a tall spidery thing of timber, 100 yards of it or more, carrying the vanished rails out across a frozen ravine on a lattice of framed wooden bents that fell away beneath the deck to the ice a long way down. It was old and gray and rimed white with frost, every beam and brace furred with it, and it stood in the failing blue light over the frozen ravine like the skeleton of some enormous thing, huge and delicate at once. 100 years of framed timber standing on the strength of nothing but good joinery and the patience of the men long dead who had raised it. And it stood in the cold as it had stood in 100 cold winters, furred white and silent. And the wind that was not blowing anywhere else in the frozen country had found a little life out over the gap, a thin, bitter draught that moved along the deck and cut through everything she wore. She should not have crossed it at dusk. She knew that as well as she knew any of the things she knew and mostly did not act on, that a frost-glazed timber trestle 100 yards long over a frozen ravine, with the light going and the cold coming down like the end of the world, is a thing a person crosses in the morning after a night's rest and a hot meal, if a person crosses it at all. But there was nothing behind her. She had walked the gray day up an empty valley and passed no barn, no shed, no hollow tree worth the name, nothing that would keep the cold off through a night that was going to go so far below zero that the going below stopped meaning anything. And she stood at the near end of the trestle and looked across it into the failing blue, and understood that the far side, whatever was there, could be no worse than the near side, which was death by morning, and that the crossing, bad as it was the only road that led anywhere but into the ground. So she crossed. She went out onto the trestle in the last of the light, and it was worse than she had thought, and she had thought it would be bad. The deck was a double line of frost-slick timbers, with the ties gone from between them in places, black gaps where a boot would go through to nothing, and the ice of the ravine showing far below, and she went from tie to tie with her arms out and her weight low, testing each one before she trusted it, the frost crunching under her boots, and the cold of the iron-hard wood coming up through her soles, and the thin bitter wind pushing at her out over the gap where there was nothing to hold to, and nothing below but the long fall to the ice. She kept her eyes on the ties and not on the drop, because the drop pulled at the eye and the mind the way the moving river had pulled at her on the pier ladder, the way all the killing places pull at you, wanting you to look, and she gave it nothing, moving her eyes from tie to tie and her boots after her eyes, one and then the next, refusing the drop, refusing the cold's whisper that she should hurry and be warm, because hurrying was the whisper the cold used to kill you. Halfway out a tie she had trusted shifted under her boot with a crack like a shot, and she went down onto her hands on the timbers with her heart stopped and one leg through a gap to the knee over the long drop, and she hung there a moment on her hands and her one good knee and did not panic. Made herself not panic. Drew the dangling leg up slow and found the next solid tie with it and came back up onto her feet and stood shaking over the gap with the wind cutting her, and then she went on, slower, testing harder, because the trestle had just told her exactly how it would kill her if she let it, and she had heard it. The light failed as she went. The blue drained out of the sky and the trestle went gray, and then dim, and then nearly dark. And she was not halfway, and she made herself keep the pace she had, slow and testing, because the cold that wanted her to hurry was the same cold that would put her through a gap or off the edge if she hurried. And she had learned in a mine shaft and on a water tower that hurrying in a dangerous place is the way the dangerous place kills you. And it was in the failing middle of that crossing, out over the deepest part of the gap, cold to the bone and half blind in the dusk, that she saw the light. It was below her and to the side, down in the timber, a faint warm gleam among the frosted beams where no light had any business being, and she stopped on the ties with her heart going and looked down at it. It was small and steady and warm, a lamp or a stove by the color of it, one point of amber deep in the black lattice of the trestle below the deck, and there was no reason on the earth for it to be there, a warm light burning in the beams of a dead trestle over a frozen ravine in the killing dark. She crouched on the ties and looked and made out, slowly letting her eyes work, the shape of it, down among the great frame timbers below the deck, built into the very lattice of the bents, where 4 heavy beams came together to make a kind of pocket in the structure, there was a room. A small dark box of a room fitted into the timber framework of the trestle itself. Hung in the beams below the deck, and warm light leaked from a seam in its wall, and she understood 2 things at once, the way she understood most things, all together and complete, that someone had built a home inside the bones of the trestle, and that she was going to get into it or die in the dark on the ice-slick deck a few feet above it. There was a way down. She found it because a person freezing to death finds things, or dies. Those are the choices the cold gives you, and it does not give you others. Where the room hung in the beams below the deck, an iron ladder was bolted to the side of a bent, going down from a gap in the deck edge into the timber, and its rungs were worn smooth on their tops amid the frost and the rust by a hand and a boot that had gone up and down them many times. And she had learned by now what a worn ladder meant, and she did not stop to marvel at it, because there was no warmth in marveling, and she went down it, down off the deadly deck into the lattice of the trestle, her hands going numb on the frozen iron, so that she gripped less with her fingers than with the hooks of her stiffening hands, taking each rung with a care she could barely afford in the cold that wanted her to fall, and at the bottom of the short climb she came to a plank landing wedged in the beams before the wall of the room, and a door, iron, rimed with frost, its latch worn bright. And she got her numb fingers through the latch and lifted it, and the door came, and warm air fell out around her, warm air, and she half fell through the door into it and pulled the door to behind her and stood in the sudden blessed warmth, shaking too hard to speak, which was as well, for there was no one to speak to. The room was small and tight and warm, and it was built into the heart of the trestle, and she stood inside the door and let the warmth take her before she looked at anything. Let it come into her hands and her face where the cold had them, the deep ache of it as the blood came back, and only when she could feel her fingers again did she look. It was a snug box of a room framed and planked inside the great timbers of the bent, close and low, its walls the very beams of the trestle where they came together, so that the structure that carried the vanished trains and the walls that kept her alive were one and the same timber, and she felt the rightness of that before she could name it. A home that was not built against the trestle or hung from it, but made of it, part of the bones of the thing, sharing its strength. It held the things she had come to know, the things they all held: a bed, an iron frame with a mattress and heaped wool blankets, a stove, a small black one, and it was lit. It was lit, banked low and glowing, which meant her tired mind worked slowly at it, which meant nothing more than that its coals were deep, and it had been burning when its keeper left, and had never gone fully out. A fire held for years in the deep ash of a well-banked stove, a table, a stool, shelves, a lantern, and the fine frost-dry dust of a place shut up a long time. Over all of it, undisturbed, no one was here. No one had been here in years. But the stove was warm, and the room was warm, and she understood later, when she could think, that it was the trestle itself that had kept it so, the room wrapped in the great timbers below the deck where the deep frost could not easily reach. The little banked stove needing only to hold its coals to keep the tight-framed box above freezing through the years, and she was alive because of it. Because a stranger had banked a fire before she was born, and the trestle had kept it. And she sat down on the floor by the little glowing stove and put her frozen hands toward it and wept a little, from the cold and the warmth and the being alive, and there was no one to see, which was the only way she would have allowed it. When she could stand, she fed the stove, and it woke and swelled and threw its heat into the little room, and she stripped off her frozen outer things and hung them to steam and thaw, and she lit the lantern, and the room came up warm and brown and close around her. A box of light and heat hung in the frozen bones of a trestle over a frozen ravine in the killing dark, and on the plank table, weighted under a smooth stone, there was a book. She took it up. She did not open it yet, though the habit of guessing was less a game tonight than a way of putting off the sleep her body screamed for, until she had done the one thing she had learned never to skip. And she looked at the little warm room in the beams and guessed at whoever had built a home in the heart of a trestle to winter over a frozen gap, and guessed at someone who worked the line in the cold, and then she opened it. Because the book was the kindness, and the book was the rule, and she had learned in a rising tank, and beneath a laboring train's smoke, and in a flooding pier never to sleep in a stranger's house without first reading the thing the stranger had left to be read. And tonight, of all nights, warm and half dead, and alone in the frozen dark, she was not going to be a fool about it. She had been a track walker. That was the shape that came up out of the pages. In a small, firm hand, a woman's, and it was a life the drifter girl had not met in any of the other books. In the deep winters, in the years when the line was worked, there had been people whose task was to walk the track in the killing cold and read the rails. Because rail is a living thing in the cold, it shrinks and pulls and the joints draw apart and, worse, the steel itself can snap clean across in a hard enough freeze, a transverse break invisible until a train finds it, and the track walkers went out in the worst of the weather to find the pull-aparts. And the cold snapped rails before the trains did, and this woman had walked this stretch, this frozen valley and this trestle, for a lifetime of winters, and had built the room in the beams to winter in, because the far towns were too far to walk back to each night, and the cold was too deep to be caught out in, and she had made a warm heart in the cold structure, and lived in it through the black months, and walked her line and kept the trains safe from the broken rails the cold made. She wrote of the walking with a plain pride that moved the drifter girl, of going out before light and weather that would kill a person who stopped moving, of the tap of her hammer on the cold rail and how she read the ring of it. The true clear note of sound steel and the dead flat note of a rail broken through, and of the winter she had found a rail snapped clean in the black of a morning and set her flag and stopped the dawn train short of a wreck that would have taken it into the ravine, and of how no one on that train had ever known, would go to their graves never knowing, that a woman walking the cold had held their lives in the ring of a hammer. And when the line closed and there were no more rails to break and no more trains to save, she had not gone, because she could not. She wrote, make herself leave a valley she had wintered in for 40 years to go and be warm and useless in a town, and so she had stayed, and walked her deadline in the cold for no wage and no reason but that the walking was the thing she was. And she wrote about the danger, because there was a danger, and it was not the cold, or not only the cold you fought with the stove. The danger was the stove. She set it apart in the middle of a page with a line ruled above and below, the way they all did. In the deep cold you will want to burn the stove hard, and the hard burning cakes the pipe. And the caked pipe catches fire. Burn it slow and clean, and if ever the pipe roars, shut the damper and starve it, and do not open the door. A fire in the pipe is a fire in the beams, and a fire in the beams is the end of everything. The drifter girl read that 3 times, and looked at the little black stove and its pipe rising through the plank ceiling into the timber above, and she understood the whole terror of it. That she was living in wood, in a box of planks hung in the dry frozen beams of 100-year-old Trestle, and that the one thing that kept her alive, the fire, was also the one thing that could kill her, and the trestle, and everything in the space of a few roaring minutes, and that the deep cold that made her want to feed the fire high was the very circumstance in which the fire was most likely to turn on her. She marked the rule. She found the damper on the pipe and worked it and understood it, and she found, hung by the stove, a long-handled scraper the trackwalker had made for cleaning the pipe, and she understood that too. And she went to her bed that first night, knowing the one deadly thing about her new house, and she banked the stove low and clean the way the rules said, and slept, warm, alive, in the frozen dark, while the trestle around her cracked and boomed in the deep cold like a thing breaking, which she would learn was only the frost in the timbers and not the end of anything. The great beams, shrinking and speaking in the cold the way they had spoken every hard winter for 100 years. The fire in the pipe came on the coldest night, as such things do, because the coldest night is the night you burn the stove hardest, and the danger and the temptation are the same weather. It had gone down and down for 3 days. The cold, deeper than she had known cold could go, the trestle booming around her, the frost creeping in white at the seams of the room. And she had burned the stove harder than she should have, because the alternative was to feel the cold coming through the walls, and she had known, feeding it, that she was doing the thing the rule warned of, caking the pipe with the hard-hot burning, and she had told herself she would clean it in the morning, which is the thing everyone tells themselves before the fire, and in the deep of that 3rd night she woke to a sound, a low roar that was not the trestle cracking, a steady rushing roar from over her head, and she was up and looking at the pipe before she was awake, and the pipe was glowing. It was glowing a dull red up its length where it rose through the ceiling into the beams, and the roar was the sound of the creosote burning inside it, a chimney fire. A fire in the pipe going up into the timber of the trestle, and she felt the terror of it whole, and at once, the terror that is different from every other. The terror of fire where you cannot run from it. Fire in the dry 100-year-old bones of the thing you are standing inside, over a frozen ravine. In the dark, 100 yards from solid ground across a deck of ice she could not cross in the dark and the cold and live. There was nowhere to go. That was the whole of it. If the beams caught she was dead, whether she stayed or ran, and the only road that did not end in death ran through the rule, and everything in her wanted to throw open the stove door and pull the fire out, to do something large and immediate, and the rule came up in her cold and clear over the panic, shut the damper and starve it, and do not open the door, and she did not open the door. She shut the damper. She shut it all the way, cutting the air, and she shut the draft at the bottom of the stove, and she starved the roaring pipe of the air it fed on, and she stood in the red glow with the scraper in her hand ready for she did not know what, and made herself not open the door. Made herself trust the rule of a woman 40 years dead over every screaming instinct she had. And the roar fought her, held, roared on for a handful of seconds that were each an age, and then, starved, began to fail. It dropped. The rushing sank to a mutter, and the mutter to a hiss, and the dull red went out of the pipe from the bottom upward, and the creosote fire, robbed of its air, guttered and died in the pipe before it could burn through into the dry beams of the trestle, and the room was dim again, and warm and whole, and she was alive, and the trestle stood. And she sat down on the floor by the ticking cooling stove and shook, late, the way she always shook, after. In the morning she cleaned the pipe. She took it down cold and ran the track walker's long scraper up it and brought down a black fall of the caked creosote that had nearly killed her, and she burned it in the stove a careful little at a time and swept the room and set it right. And she did not burn the stove hard again, not once, all the rest of that deep winter, learning instead the harder discipline the rule had really meant, which was not a trick to save you from the fire, but a whole way of living with the fire, slow and clean and watchful, burning small and often instead of large and seldom, keeping the pipe clean the way the woman had kept it clean, so that the fire never had the chance to turn. She understood, cleaning the pipe in the gray-cold morning, why the woman had lived 40 winters in a box of planks in the dry beams of a trestle and never burned. It was not luck, and it was not some special gift, it was only this, the doing of the deadly thing right every single time. The refusal ever to lie down with a caked pipe and a hope. And the drifter girl resolved, kneeling there with the black scale in her hands, to be worthy of the room the same way, by the same daily unglamorous care, for as long as she kept it. She took up her notebook and wrote the rule down first, before anything the way she had come to do. Burn it slow and clean. If the pipe roars, shut the damper and starve it. Do not open the door. She underlined it twice. And below it she wrote a second line. She wintered here 40 years and did not burn. She looked at that a while. Then she went on. The deep winter took on a shape. She stopped counting the days. There were barely days to count, only the long blue dark and the few gray hours of light between. She learned to live in the cold the way the track walker had, small and clean and watchful, the stove burning low and steady, the pipe kept clean, the blankets heaped, and she came to know the trestle in the cold, its booming and cracking in the hard nights that had frightened her at first and became, like the wind in the water tank and the trains in the deep rock, only the voice of the place, the great timbers speaking as they shrank and swelled with the cold, saying, she came to feel, that they were holding, that they had held 100 winters and would hold this one. She learned the discipline of the fire past all forgetting, the slow, clean burning. The pipe scraped clean every few days, whether it seemed to need it or not, and she found that the discipline was not a burden, but a comfort, once it was a habit. That there was a deep peace in doing the one deadly thing right, in never again lying down at night, with a caked pipe and a hope. And she thought that this too was a thing the track walker had known, that the careful keeping of a danger is its own kind of ease. She walked the line on the clear days, because a person cannot live in a track walker's room and not come to walk the track, and she went out in the brutal cold with the scarf over her face and read the rails the way the woman's ledger taught her, tapping them with a hammer she found by the door, and listening for the true ring or the dead flat note, though there were no trains now to save, looking for the pull-aparts and the cold broken steel. And where she found a rail snapped clean across by the frost she noted it in her book, a track walked and read for no train and no wage. Because the walking was a watch, and a watch is a watch. She kept the stove clean. She kept the crossing swept of the worst of its ice so she could get out to gather deadfall from the near timber, and she learned the safe ties and the rotten ones until she could cross the deck in the half-dark as surely as the track walker must have crossed it, though she never again crossed it careless. And she left untouched the small things that had been the track walker's. Out of the courtesy she paid all of them. She never learned the whole of her. She did not expect to. But she came to know the shape of the woman's mind by living in her warm room in the frozen beams and keeping her fire the careful way and walking her dead line in the cold. And she thought that the track walker had been the toughest of all the keepers she had found, a woman who had chosen to winter over a frozen gap in a box in the beams and walk the killing cold for 40 years to keep trains safe from the breaking rails, and had counted it a life worth living, and had gone on living it after the trains were gone, for no one, because the watch was the thing she was, And the drifter girl, keeping that watch now, walking that line now, keeping that careful fire now in the heart of the frozen trestle, understood her, the way she had come to understand all of them, and understood by now that the understanding was the whole of the inheritance, that these lives were not left to her by accident, that a person who crosses the frozen trestles of the world looking for the warm light in the beams is exactly the person the keepers had been keeping their fires for. On an evening in the last hard week of the winter, she sat in the little warm room in the beams by the ticking stove with the lantern lit and the trackwalker's ledger closed under its stone and her own notebook open on her knee, the frost white at the seams of the room and the trestle booming its slow, cold song around her, holding, outside the cold still pressed on the land the way it had pressed all the black months. But she could feel, in the small lengthening of the gray hours, and a certain change in the quality of the light on the snow, that the deep of it had passed, that the winter had shown her its worst, and she had met the worst, and kept the room through it, and that the room was hers now in the only way these places ever became anyone's, not by the crossing that found it, but by the winter she had kept it through. She was 23 years old. She had a folding knife, a box of matches, a tin cup, and a little under $9 she had not spent, and now had nowhere to spend, and did not miss. She had a warm room framed in the frozen bones of a trestle over a frozen ravine, a stove she had learned to keep the careful way, a scraper and a rule that had saved her, a line she walked for no train, and a book she had not written full of the toughest of all the lives she had found. She turned to a fresh page and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and the cold pressed white and enormous against the little warm box of the room and did not get in, held off by a banked fire, and 100 years of good timber, and the careful keeping of a woman long gone, and a girl who had crossed a frozen trestle at dusk to get here, and she began to write, in the small firm hand she was learning from a track walker 40 years dead, the first line of the keeping of the only home she had ever made her own,